Welcome back, history explorers. Before we dive headfirst into one of the most shocking episodes in American political history, do me a favor and absolutely smash that subscribe button. Hit the bell while you're at it because you're about to witness a story so unbelievable, so explosive, that it was buried for nearly a century. This is the kind of truth that powerful people don't want you to know. Think about this question. What would America look like today if, during the darkest depths of the Great Depression, the wealthiest industrialists in the country had actually succeeded in their brazen attempt to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt and install a military dictator? By the end of this video, you'll know just how terrifyingly close we came to losing our democracy forever, and why this earth-shattering conspiracy remains one of history's most suppressed secrets. Picture the scene. It's the summer of 1933, and America is bleeding. The economy has collapsed so completely that 1 in 4 workers can't find a job. Banks are failing by the thousands, with 4,000 institutions going under in 1933 alone, wiping out $140 billion in savings. Families who had savings accounts are now standing in breadlines. The middle class is evaporating overnight. Children are dropping out of school to scavenge for food. Into this desperate chaos steps Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man the business elite see as nothing less than a destroyer of civilization. FDR has abandoned the sacred gold standard, forcing Americans to sell their gold to the government at gunpoint. He's launched alphabet soup agencies like the CC, the TVA, the NRA, flooding the economy with government workers and regulations that make Wall Street's blood boil. To the millionaires and industrialists who built America, Roosevelt isn't just a bad president, he's a traitor to his own class. But one man stands above all others as a potential savior for their desperate cause. Enter Major General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in American history. This is a warrior who earned 2 medals of honor in separate conflicts. A man who fought in the Philippines, China during the Boxer Rebellion, Mexico at Veracruz, Haiti, and commanded 2 million troops in France during World War I. Saint-Thomas. Here's what makes Butler perfect for their scheme. He's not just respected by fellow officers, he's beloved by enlisted men and veterans across America. When the Bonus Army marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of their promised bonuses, Butler was one of the few authority figures who showed up to support them. While General MacArthur was driving desperate veterans out of their camps with tanks and tear gas, Butler was standing with the common soldier. Conspiracy begins with a knock on Butler's door in July 1933. Gerald McGuire, a smooth-talking bond salesman from Grayson MP Murphy's Wall Street brokerage, arrives with an unusual request. He wants Butler to speak at the American Legion Convention in Chicago, and he's brought along a prepared speech about returning America to the gold standard. Butler immediately senses something fishy. Why would a Legion speech focus on monetary policy instead of veterans' issues? McGuire doesn't come empty-handed. He flashes a bank book showing deposits of over $40,000, a fortune during the Depression that no ordinary bond salesman could possess. He's accompanied by Bill Doyle, a former American Legion commander, and their presence signals this isn't some amateur operation. These men represent serious money and serious power. But this is only the beginning of a courtship that will unfold over more than a year. McGuire returns to Butler's modest home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, again and again, each time revealing a little more of the shocking conspiracy taking shape. He boasts that his backers have already raised $3 million and can secure $3 million more within 24 hours if Butler gives the nod. $3 million in 1934 had the purchasing power of roughly $60 million today. By late 1933, McGuire's mysterious sponsors bankroll something unprecedented, a 7-month fact-finding tour of Europe. McGuire isn't going as a tourist. He's studying how fascist movements seized power across the continent. He spends time analyzing Mussolini's black shirts in Italy, examines Hitler's brown shirts in Germany. When McGuire returns from Europe in 1934, he's absolutely starry-eyed about what he's witnessed. He explains to Butler how easy it was for disciplined groups of veterans to surround parliamentary buildings and force political change. The template is clear. Mass veterans demonstrations can topple governments without firing a single shot. In September 1934, McGuire makes his final play. He corners Butler one last time, and this meeting is different from all the others. He's carrying $18,000 and $1,000 bills as walking around money. This isn't a loan or an investment. It's pocket cash to demonstrate the vast resources at his disposal. McGuire lays out the complete blueprint with breathtaking audacity. Step 1. Recruit 500,000 veterans into a new patriotic organization financed by some of the most powerful names in American business. The backers include Pierre, Irene, and Lama DuPont of the chemical empire, Robert Sterling Clark, whose Singer sewing machine fortune tops $30 million, and Grayson M.P. Murphy, a director of Goodyear Bethlehem Steel and multiple J.P. Morgan banks. Step 2. March this half-million-man army on Washington, D.C. The mere spectacle of that many uniformed veterans will intimidate Congress and overwhelm the Capitol's pathetic defenses. Washington has only 1,400 police officers and minimal National Guard units. Against 500,000 disciplined ex-soldiers, the city would be helpless. Step 3. Force Roosevelt to appoint Butler as Secretary of General Affairs, a newly created position that would essentially run the government, while FDR is reduced to a ceremonial figurehead. McGuire assures Butler there will be no bloodshed. The mere display of overwhelming force will compel Roosevelt to cooperate, just like the King of Italy cooperated with Mussolini. McGuire reveals that weapons and equipment will come from Remington Arms Company, which has been controlled by the DuPont family since 1932. Everything is in place. The money, the weapons, the organizational structure. All they need is Butler to serve as the face of the operation. We need a man on a white horse, McGuire tells Butler with complete confidence. And you are the ideal leader. The bond salesman has clearly done his homework. Butler has the military credentials, the public recognition, and most importantly, the trust of America's veterans. If anyone can rally 500,000 ex-soldiers, it's the legendary old Gimlet Eye. But McGuire has made a catastrophic miscalculation. Butler may be bitter about his treatment by the Hoover administration, but he's not a traitor. The same moral code that made him a hero on foreign battlefields now compels him to defend American democracy at home. Butler plays along just long enough to gather intelligence. He asks probing questions about the conspiracy scope and leadership. McGuire eagerly provides names and details, apparently convinced that Butler is wavering and might be persuaded to join their cause. When McGuire mentions that a major announcement is coming within weeks, Butler pays attention. Sure enough, 2 weeks later headlines announce the formation of the American Liberty League, an ostensibly bipartisan organization led by former New York Governor Al Smith, 1924. Democratic presidential nominee John W. Davis, and DuPont chemical Irene DuPont. The League claims to defend constitutional government against Roosevelt's dictatorship. But Butler now knows it's the public front for the fascist conspiracy. Butler realizes he's uncovered something monstrous. For the first time, he understands that the conspiracy isn't the fantasy of a few disgruntled businessmen. It's a coordinated effort, backed by some of America's wealthiest and most powerful families. These people have the resources to actually attempt what they're planning. Working carefully and methodically, Butler recruits a crucial ally, Paul Comley French, a respected investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Record. French agrees to pose as a disaffected New Deal critic and interview McGuire independently. The bond salesman, now completely confident in his cause, repeats the entire conspiracy almost verbatim to French. "We need a fascist government in this country," McGuire tells the reporter with chilling directness, "to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all that we have built in America. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smedley Butler is the ideal leader. He could organize 1 million men overnight." McGuire confirms that Remington Arms will supply the weapons thanks to their partnership with the DuPonts. He outlines the financial backing and explains how they expect Roosevelt to cooperate once presented with fait accompli. French emerges from the interview pale, but convinced that Butler's incredible story is absolutely true. On November 20th, 1934, Butler strides into a wood-paneled hearing room in Manhattan to face the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities, better known as the McCormack-Dickstein Committee. This is a precursor to the later House Un-American Activities Committee, and it's been investigating foreign propaganda activities in the United States. May I preface my remarks by saying, sir, Butler begins his sworn testimony, that I have one interest in all of this, and that is to try to do my best to see that a democracy is maintained in this country. Over the course of several hours, he methodically lays out every meeting, every conversation, every promise of money, and every detail of the conspiracy to overthrow the American government. The committee, chaired by Congressman John W. McCormack of Massachusetts and vice-chaired by Samuel Dickstein of New York, grills Butler intensively. They're clearly skeptical. The story sounds too fantastic to believe. But Butler sticks to the facts, providing dates, names, amounts of money, and specific conversations. His reputation for absolute honesty during 33 years of military service carries enormous weight. The next morning, the New York Times dismisses Butler's testimony as gigantic ballyhoo. But the committee isn't finished. They subpoena McGuire, who is forced to appear under oath and answer questions about his activities. Under intense interrogation, McGuire admits to handling far larger sums of money than he initially claimed, but he denies plotting a coup. The paper trail tells a different story. Committee investigators trace checks from stockbroker Robert Clark and deposits linked to Murphy's brokerage that dwarf McGuire's legitimate salary. They discover that McGuire was simultaneously serving as cashier for the committee for a sound dollar and sound currency, an organization dedicated to returning America to the gold standard. Most damning of all, the committee verifies that McGuire's sponsors did indeed finance his 7-month European tour to study fascist veterans organizations. His research mission was designed to provide a template for a similar fascist takeover in America. When the conspiracy began to unravel thanks to Butler's courage, McGuire became the expendable fall guy. After 2 months of investigation, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee issues its final report in February 1935. Buried on page 10 is their stunning conclusion. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that again. A congressional committee, after thorough investigation, concluded that wealthy Americans had actually conspired to overthrow the United States government. This wasn't fantasy or paranoia. This was real. But here's where the story takes an even more sinister turn. Despite finding credible evidence of treason, no indictments are filed. No one is arrested. No one faces trial. The most powerful democracy in the world discovers a conspiracy to destroy it, and the conspirators walk away without consequence. Why? The answer lies in the staggering influence of the men involved. DuPont chemists supplied critical materials for American industry and had massive government contracts. J.P. Morgan banks underwrote U.S. Treasury bonds and controlled vast sectors of the economy, publicly prosecuting these titans, while the nation was still reeling from depression, risked triggering another financial panic. Even more troubling, the committee's published report was heavily censored. Journalist John L. Spivak of New Masses magazine managed to obtain unexpurgated testimony that revealed extensive connections between the plotters and major Wall Street firms. The committee had deliberately deleted evidence showing the full scope of the conspiracy and the prominent names involved. J.P. Morgan's senior partners pressured newspaper editors to treat Butler's charges as fantasy. The same media companies that depended on Wall Street advertising revenue suddenly developed amnesia about one of the biggest political scandals in American history. The story that should have dominated headlines for months disappeared into the footnotes. Butler, undeterred by the media blackout, takes his case directly to the American people. He appears on radio shows nationwide, warning that war is a racket and that fascism often comes wearing a business suit rather than a uniform. He tells audiences that the greatest threats to democracy often come from within. from those who wrap themselves in the flag while plotting to destroy the Constitution. The general's warnings proved prophetic in more ways than one. McGuire, the bond salesman who served as the conspiracy's point man, dies suddenly in March 1935, just 1 month after the committee's final report. Officially, the cause of death is pneumonia. Butler publicly calls the timing convenient. Grayson Murphy continues his career as a respected Wall Street financier. The DuPonts quietly rebrand their public image with the slogan "Better Things" for better living through chemistry, and become major suppliers for America's World War II effort. The American Liberty League folds quietly in 1940, after Roosevelt's landslide re-election victory proves that Americans have no interest in their constitutional message. But the what-ifs from this conspiracy are absolutely terrifying. Had Butler accepted their offer, 500,000 veterans could have overwhelmed Washington's defenses overnight. With most major newspapers already sympathetic to big business, a junta proclaiming a patriotic emergency might have seized control of national communications. Radio networks could have been commandeered to broadcast propaganda supporting the new regime. A compliant Supreme Court, then hostile to most New Deal reforms, might have rubber-stamped constitutional changes legitimizing the takeover. The same justices who struck down key New Deal programs as unconstitutional might have found legal justification for emergency government by business leaders and military officials. Consider the international implications. Hitler had just come to power in Germany in 1933. Mussolini was consolidating his fascist regime in Italy. If America had fallen to a business-backed coup in 1934, the entire trajectory of the 20th century would have changed. There would have been no New Deal to demonstrate that democratic capitalism could respond to economic crisis. There would have been no American leadership against fascism in World War II tie. The conspirators had studied European fascism carefully and adapted its methods for American conditions. They understood that Americans would never accept jackbooted stormtroopers marching through the streets. Instead, they planned to use respected veterans in a patriotic movement to save the country from communist influence. The rhetoric would be draped in American flag imagery and constitutional language. This wasn't some half-baked scheme by political amateurs. These were sophisticated businessmen with vast resources and detailed planning. They had studied successful fascist takeovers in Europe and adapted the template for American political culture. They had secured financing, weapon supplies, and organizational structures. Most crucially, they had identified the perfect figurehead in Butler, a man whose reputation could legitimize their actions. The conspiracy reveals how thin the line between democracy and dictatorship really is. American democratic institutions, Congress, the courts, the press, all failed to adequately respond to credible evidence of treason. The wealthy conspirators escaped consequences not because they were innocent, but because they were too powerful to prosecute. Butler's decision to expose the plot, rather than join it, may have been the most important act of patriotism in American history. A lesser man, bitter about his treatment by politicians, might have been tempted by promises of power and glory. Butler shows a duty to the Constitution over personal ambition. The media's role in suppressing the story demonstrates the dangers of concentrated ownership and corporate influence over news coverage. Major newspapers, dependent on Wall Street advertising revenue, had every incentive to minimize coverage of a scandal that implicated their biggest advertisers. The very business interests that funded the conspiracy also controlled the channels of public information. The 1930s were a crucial testing period for democratic institutions worldwide. While Germany, Italy, Spain, and other countries succumbed to fascist movements, America's democracy survived, but only barely, and only because one man chose honor over power. The conspiracy shows that American exceptionalism is not guaranteed by geography or culture, but must be actively defended by individuals willing to sacrifice for democratic principles. Looking at the specific mechanics of the planned coup reveals sophisticated understanding of American political psychology. The conspirators knew that Americans would resist obvious foreign ideologies like German Nazism or Italian fascism. Instead, they wrapped their authoritarianism in familiar American symbols: veterans, patriotism, constitutional government, and anti-communist sentiment. This was fascism with an American face. The role of veterans in the conspiracy was particularly insidious. These were men who had genuinely served their country in war, many of whom were struggling economically during the Depression. The plotters planned to exploit their legitimate grievances against government policies and channel their frustration into supporting authoritarian change. It was a cynical manipulation of patriotic sentiment for anti-democratic purposes. The international context makes the conspiracy even more chilling. By 1934, fascist movements were gaining ground across Europe. Hitler had consolidated power in Germany. Mussolini was firmly entrenched in Italy, and similar movements were emerging in France, Spain, and other countries. A successful fascist coup in America would have fundamentally altered the global balance of power, and likely prevented effective resistance to European fascism. The aftermath of Butler's revelations shows the conspiracy's true scope and power. Despite credible evidence presented to Congress, despite witness testimony and documentary proof, the story was systematically buried. This wasn't accidental. It was a coordinated campaign by powerful interests to protect themselves from the consequences of their treason. The business leaders involved represented a cross-section of American economic power. Chemicals, DuPont; finance, J.P. Morgan; manufacturing, General Motors; steel, Bethlehem; and arms, Remington. These weren't peripheral figures or fringe extremists. They were pillars of the American establishment who controlled vast economic resources and political influence. Their plan reveals sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate democratic institutions while destroying democratic values. They would have maintained the form of constitutional government while gutting its substance. Congress would continue to meet. Elections might still occur, but real power would rest with business leaders operating behind a military figurehead. This type of soft authoritarianism has become a template for how democratic backsliding occurs in the modern world. Rather than dramatic military coups with tanks in the streets, contemporary threats to democracy often come through legal and institutional changes that concentrate power while maintaining democratic facades. The role of media manipulation in the conspiracy's aftermath demonstrates another key vulnerability in democratic systems. The same economic interests that funded the plot also controlled major information channels. Their ability to minimize coverage, shape public perception, and protect co-conspirators shows how concentrated media ownership can undermine democratic accountability. Butler's courage in exposing the conspiracy reminds us that democracy ultimately depends on individuals willing to put principle above personal interest. He was offered immense power, wealth, and influence in exchange for betraying his oath to the Constitution. His refusal and decision to publicly expose the conspiracy may have saved American democracy. The consequences of the conspiracy's exposure extended far beyond the immediate participants. Roosevelt's administration became more alert to threats from business interests. The failure of the plot likely contributed to increased support for New Deal programs as evidence of business hostility to democratic governance became public. The international implications were equally significant. Had the conspiracy succeeded, America would have joined the fascist camp rather than opposing it. Without American leadership and resources, the fight against European fascism would have been far more difficult. The entire trajectory of World War II and the post-war world would have been fundamentally different. In conclusion, the business plot of 1933 represents the closest America has ever come to losing its democracy through internal conspiracy. Only the integrity of one man, Major General Smedley Butler, prevented a fascist takeover that could have changed world history. The story reminds us that democratic institutions are fragile and that their survival depends on individuals willing to defend them against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This conspiracy should be taught in every American history class and remembered as a crucial moment when the country's democratic future hung in the balance. The fact that it remains largely unknown demonstrates the lasting power of the interests that sought to suppress it. But the story also proves that truth eventually emerges and that courage can triumph over power when ordinary people are willing to act extraordinarily. So the next time someone tells you that coups can't happen in America, remember 1933. Remember Gerald McGuire's briefcase full of cash. Remember the 500,000 veterans that almost marched on Washington. And remember that democracy survived not because of our institutions, but because of Smedley Butler's conscience. Hit that subscribe button if stories like this fascinate you. And remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.